Life is pretty remarkable. It's very easy to forget how convenient it can be for us. The conditions on Earth that support life are basically perfect. You might think, what are the odds? It's almost undeniable that this is no mere accident, but the masterwork of an omnipotent crafter, right? Well, no. This argument is called fine-tuning, and it is the subject of this video. Specifically, I'll be evaluating a video made by a channel called Testify, called A Top-Tier Argument for God's Existence. So I wanted to talk about fine-tuning because not only do I see it as an abject abuse of statistics, but also an argument for faithless theism. It's a common way to support intelligent design, or the idea that the universe must have been intentionally created by an intelligent being or beings. Now, I won't be arguing for or against intelligent design itself, because the definition is pretty vague, to the point of basically being meaningless, much like other common philosophical topics like free will and consequentialism. There is some discourse in those topics, and I may eventually make videos that explore them, but today I just want to evaluate the fine-tuning argument. So, we'll get into the details of fine-tuning, probability theory, the Anthropic Principle, the Puddle Analogy, the math, and finally its religious implications to place fine-tuning in the proper tier, the garbage tier. The basis of the video can be summarized by a famous quotation. I could prove God statistically. Take the human body alone. The chances that all the functions of an individual would just happen is a statistical monstrosity. That unfortunate quotation comes from George Gallup, the statistician and the namesake of the Gallup poll, and it's the source of our problem here. Now, Testify liberally uses this sentiment in his video with several examples of supposed statistical monstrosities, like pulling royal flushes multiple times or winning the lottery repeatedly, essentially saying that we as humans won the jackpot because there are so many ways that life as we know it could easily have not existed. And this is fine-tuning, the idea that there are universal parameters that make the conditions for life as we know it just right for life as we know it. And furthermore, the probability of this happening is so minuscule that it erases all doubt of there being an intelligent creator or creators. So here are some cited examples from Testify of those supposed statistical monstrosities using Wojaks.
Gravitational constant. If gravity were even slightly stronger or weaker by 1 part in 10 to the 40th power, stars wouldn't form properly, and without stars, there's no life. The cosmological constant. This governs the expansion of the universe. If it were just a fraction different by 1 part in 10 to the 120th power, the universe would either collapse on itself or expand too rapidly for galaxies to form. Both scenarios equal no life. The strong nuclear force. This holds the nuclei of atoms together. If it were just 2% stronger or weaker, no stable elements would exist. The electromagnetic force. If this force were even slightly off, atoms couldn't hold together. Forget about water, carbon, or any building blocks for life.
Now, I want to warn, we'll be getting pretty abstract here. Whether you believe in separate universes that exist alongside our own universe, or you think that our universe could have turned out differently, either way you draw from the sample set of hypothetical universes. I don't really know how any meaningful probability can be computed from these examples Testify has given us. These constants are being treated as random variables in that set, but there's no basis for how they would be distributed, which is a basic aspect of probability, and even if we assumed a normal distribution, which is already an astronomical stretch, we have basically no basis for either the mean or standard deviation. We cannot observe any other universes in any capacity, not only to determine the distribution of these variables, but even determine whether any variables exist across all potential universes. There could be universes where there is no concept of these constants that seem so fundamental to us. That's why hypothetical universes are such a tricky subject. Unfortunately, we have a terribly narrow understanding and imagination that is limited to our universe and not much of it. So I don't blame Testify for applying concepts from our universe onto others, and then turning an arbitrary crank an arbitrary amount and keeping everything else the same. In other words, fine-tuning the hypothetical universe to not have life as we know it. And I use the phrase life as we know it because the following sentiment is not lost on me. What if things were different? Well, that would be different. Life in a different universe would reasonably look different, but we hardly understand life as it exists in our universe, and we certainly don't have the capacity to understand alternative concepts that would be present in other universes but not our own. Something like life, but different. I can't describe it because how could I? The words don't exist, so I am forced to put it into words that represent concepts from our universe. We do have science fiction concepts of other life forms in franchises like Star Wars, but even those are human-centric. Humanoid figures, similar anatomy, communicating through speech. We need to get far more abstract. Regenerative forms with alternative senses. Entire planets that are one organism. Living beings that aren't made of cells or any building blocks at all. A universe where nothing is differentiable and there is no concept of matter. An alternative concept of sentience or determinism where behaviors aren't even universal. Even these examples can't escape the confines of humanity's tiny imagination. We can't separate ourselves from the context of life as we know it. Even in our universe, our observations are limited, and we would have no way of knowing if, say, subatomic particles are sentient. There's a philosophical concept called Fermi's paradox that states that we should probably see more evidence for life elsewhere in our universe if it is probable, but our lack of evidence seems much more reasonable once you ask the questions, would we be able to observe other life even if it was there? If it was, would we recognize the signs? Is other life all around us and hiding, intentionally or not? And because of that, I understand why Testify frames this universe as a win. We appraise universes and most things based on how well they treat life as we know it. And the universe that contains life as we know it, what do you know, treats it well. It's a natural bias that has helped humans survive. It's the human-centric motivation that justifies fine-tuning as a whole. I'll be the first to admit that I personally am biased towards humanity and life. The life we know is contingent on many things, but it's not unique in that regard. Even something as insignificant to us as the location of a speck of dust on Mars is contingent on countless things, but we care much less about that, no matter how unique its shape. We also can't know all the alternatives to life that find our universe to be just unsuitable enough not to manifest or last long enough to be observed. So even assuming that we can accurately simulate these contrived alternate universes that Testify gives us, he effectively calls them worthless by definition, since they don't turn out exactly the same. And there's no way to find value in a different universe if your basis for value is that the universe is the same as ours. So Testify does mention the Anthropic Principle, which points out that only a universe that can support observers can be observed. I'm not a huge fan of the Anthropic Principle as it's usually presented, and he delivers another devastating retort with Wojak's and lottery analogies, except this time I think it's about being shot, but I want to take it in a different direction. Because we can only observe a small fraction of our universe alone, probability is not applicable. Probability is a human construct invented to explain events which can be replicated, and thus as you get more specific, probabilities get lowered naturally. Paradoxically, you can find that any event occurring is infinitesimally unlikely the more specific you get. If you take a standard deck of 52 playing cards and shuffle it well, the probability that you would have gotten the exact ordering you did is about 10 to the negative 67, far lower than any probability that Testify will speculate about later in the video. You can be almost certain that that ordering of cards has never occurred before and it will never happen again. Now that is the same probability of shuffling the cards randomly and ending up with a sorted order. You probably wouldn't think much of the seemingly random order when it happens, but imagine if your entire existence was centered around that ordering. You couldn't understand or even observe any other ordering, and it was advantageous for you to think your existence as remarkable. You'd probably find it much more interesting. We're not some objective entities in some inter-universal casino racking up universes as either wins or consolation. We can't be separated from our universe because our connection to it is what makes it important to us. And you can apply the paradox of probability to nearly anything. If you get specific enough about the weather in a specific area, the temperature, humidity, wind speed, and direction, you can achieve a much lower probability than 10 to the negative 67, even if it's based on weather that has happened somewhere before. You can do it with any event, too, by adding enough specificity and universal context to the point that everything that ever happened looks like much less of a possibility than something relatively common, like simply being struck by lightning multiple times. And Testify does bring up the multiverse by name just to dismiss it as pure speculation. As I said before, whether you believe they exist or not, hypothetical universes are on the table if you believe our universe could have turned out differently. To say that these hypothetical universes require a universe generator is to beg the question of intelligent design. If we do reject the idea of potential universes entirely, though, the probability becomes much more simple. If we want to do probability like real statisticians, we say that the universe we know has life as we know it, so there's a 100% chance of life as we know it. Also, the scope is constructed by us, so we can even say that there is life in 50 out of 50 U.S. states, which gives us 100% with a statistically significant sample size to boot. It doesn't look so improbable at all now, and unlike Testify, I'm using places that we can see in that measurement. Now, obviously this is silly, but this form of finite frequentism has no alternative when we can't observe other universes. However, when we look at his math later, we'll assume he believes in hypothetical universes once again to give him the benefit of the doubt. Testify treats the puddle analogy in much the same way as the Anthropic Principle. The puddle analogy states that a philosophical sentient puddle could easily find the hole it resides in to perfectly fit, thus concluding that it must be the result of intentional design. However, Testify does gloss over the most important part of it, adaptation. Life is not a flexible liquid, he says, but has very specific requirements. Life has changed and adapted for a very long time to different circumstances. Life moves extremely quickly compared to geological processes, so it tends to have a rather hardy constitution, even following events like asteroid strikes and supervolcanic eruptions. There are even classes of organisms called extremophiles, which can survive in seemingly impossible circumstances and extremely dynamic environments. Us humans, though, are not extremophiles because we have found a relatively constant environment on Earth's surface and adapted to live on what was readily available. Everything that couldn't adapt is no longer with us. Now, Testify's argument is that this doesn't matter, though, because it's about whether life could at all exist in a universe, seeing as how tweaking things could easily derail it. I think that the same principle applies, though. Just as humans have adapted to assume a relatively constant environment, life as we know it adapted even harder to a much more constant set of universal circumstances. It was allowed to make very safe and particular assumptions about the conditions of our universe, in the sense that there were so many things for which it never had to prepare, so of course it probably wouldn't be suited to a different universe. So next, let's get to the math portion of the video. I was initially not really following him here because probabilities have very careful language and he was being quite vague. Luckily, I think I found the article he copied this from, which was a little more technical. So I'll show the actual equation here to show how he arrived at this number. I also want to rearrange the equation to show how he arrived at his prior probability of intelligent design, which is the one where he says 1 in, I don't know, 10 to the 28, just off the top of my head. The three numbers that we're paying attention to are the following: the odds that there is an intelligent creator, the probability that an intelligent creator would choose to create a life-permitting universe, and the probability that a life-permitting universe would exist without an intelligent creator. So one of the numbers is derived backwards from the other. You might even say finely tuned. I don't really know the basis for the other numbers. They are, though, much, much larger than the simple card shuffle probability that we talked about earlier. And as creative as these numbers are, I can't call them right or wrong. Probability is an abstraction of reality, and there is plenty of that going on here. Now, I personally would estimate that since intelligence as we know it requires life as we know it, that an intelligent creator would be less likely than a universe simply creating life as we know it by chance. Of course, that creator could have been created by another intelligent creator, and it could be turtles all the way down. But these numbers are so far beyond salvation, I don't want to try to correct them. Now, I said earlier that I am not here to argue against the existence of intelligent creators, and so I want to give a religious-minded criticism of fine-tuning when I call it faithless theism. There's always going to be a little faith, but fine-tuning is, I think, taking the biggest leap of faith normally associated with religion and replacing it with, well, the dubious probability I computed is greater than 0.99, so might as well believe, I guess. I'm not saying you have to be religious to be a theist, but it certainly isn't religious to say that an intelligent creator is subservient to faith in a contrived number between 0 and 1. This is one of the reasons I see fine-tuning as a rationalization. If the probability ended up being much lower, would that change anyone's mind here? It's speculation, but I would venture to guess not. It would probably just necessitate more fine-tuning of the assumed probabilities until the answer is once again high. The numbers have no basis, so they can't be made any more wrong than they are now, and people aren't practically capable of comprehending numbers this small. So it'd be easy to increase or decrease them based on what is convenient. And that's about all I wanted to touch on from Testify's video. I hope I've convinced you that among all arguments for intelligent design, fine-tuning stands far and below its peers. And like I said at the beginning, intelligent design is ill-defined, and not everyone believes that a creator is contingent on reason. But if you need a reason to believe, I think the most compelling one is if it brings you fulfillment. It may sound selfish, but I mean it in the way that all decisions are ultimately selfish. Sometimes, though, that comes in the form of fulfilling your needs to put you in a better space to help others fulfill their needs. Just because life isn't improbable doesn't mean it's not special. You decide what's special.